A frozen mummy is offering new insights into human history and geography.
The Iceman, as he's known, has been the subject of scientific study since he was discovered in 1991.
High in the frozen Alps, a body lay hidden for over 5,000 years until a chance discovery changed history. This wasn't just a mummy. This was a slaying victim, a time capsule, and a genetic mystery waiting to be solved.
Researchers are trying to use his genetic code to uncover his true origins, to track down his relatives, alive even today.
What could his DNA possibly reveal? Was he a missing link in Europe's ancestry, or something far more unsettling? Scientists thought they had the answers, until new evidence turned everything upside down. Today, we'll uncover Ötzi the Iceman's true origins, his violent death, and the terrifying secrets buried in his genes. Discovery in the ice. High in the frozen silence of the Ötztal Alps, the late summer sun of September 1991 revealed a secret that had been locked away for more than 5 millennia. Erika and Helmut Simon, a German couple accustomed to rugged mountain treks, were navigating a remote pass straddling the border between Austria and Italy. The air was thin, the glacier beneath them unforgiving. But the ice was loosening its grip in the seasonal thaw. That's when they saw it. Something unusual protruding from the melting ice. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic, but not unheard of sight. The body of a lost climber, taken by the mountains. Yet, as they drew closer, the scene became stranger. The body was not dressed in the bright synthetic fabrics or equipped with modern climbing gear that such an accident would suggest. Instead, the figure wore thick leather shoes stuffed with grass, a primitive but ingenious insulation against the bitter alpine cold. A tattered cloak woven from grass fibers clung to his shoulders, and on his feet were leggings made of goat hide. These weren't relics of the last few decades. They were artifacts from a time far older. The most striking object was in his grasp, a copper axe, its blade covered in a green patina from centuries of oxidation. This was no ordinary hiker. The axe alone hinted at a level of craftsmanship that pushed the boundaries of what historians thought they knew about early metallurgy in Europe. Alarmed authorities quickly dispatched helicopters with archaeologists and forensic experts to the site. Recovering the remains was an arduous task because of the freezing conditions, and because it dawned on them fairly early on that what they were recovering was more than just a skeleton. The flesh was leathery, purplish blackened yipikin from centuries in the ice, and still intact. His internal organs, hair, and even stomach contents were carefully preserved by the cold. Such preservation is unheard of for such old remains. Carbon dating confirmed the unthinkable. The man in the ice had died somewhere around the year 3300 BCE, which made him from the age of copper. Over 5 millennia old, now older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge. He was called Ötzi after the Ötztal Valley in which he was discovered, and he soon became one of the most significant archaeological discoveries ever. Yet what made Ötzi stand out was not so much his antiquity as the remarkably complete nature of his discovery. In contrast to other skeletons for burial, this was a full-fledged, relational, living exhibit from prehistory. His clothes, tools, weapons, and even his last meal remained with him. Every item made a more or less unmediated link to the everyday life of the man who walked the mountains thousands of years before the first written records were made. Yet the most enthralling mysteries were not his life, but his death. Some early investigations were very unsettling. The placement of the body, the condition of its wounds, and the nature of the artifacts found with him all hinted that his last moments were nothing but horrible. Ötzi wasn't some poor fellow who had simply wandered into the mountains and succumbed to the cold. Instead, slaying presented itself as sudden violence with intent. The glacier preserves far more than a body. It is the frozen state of a slaying scene. And as forensic scientists would soon learn, the Iceman's final hours told a story of blood, betrayal, and a fight for survival in the high Alps. Life and death in the Copper Age. By the time of his death, Ötzi was about 45 years old, no small feat for the Copper Age, when the average life expectancy was barely half that. He stood around 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed just over 110 pounds. A slight frame by modern standards, but his bones told the story of a man hardened by a lifetime in a harsh alpine world. His muscles bore the wear of endless climbing, carrying loads and enduring bitter winters. This was a man who survived not by chance, but by skill and resilience. One of the most unusual aspects of Ötzi's body was his tattoos, not the decorative designs of modern times, but a series of 61 simple black lines and crosses etched into his skin. These markings were located near joints and along his spine, places where arthritis and strain would have caused chronic pain. Scientists believe they may have been part of a primitive medical practice similar to acupuncture, meant to relieve discomfort and improve mobility. In this sense, Ötzi's tattoos were less an expression of art than a form of therapy, evidence of how even ancient people sought ways to manage pain. His attire was effective and thoroughly tailored to survive in the brutal mountain climate. Goat hide leggings shield his legs from the terrible wind, while a bearskin cap keeps him warm. A cloak fashioned of woven grass goes over his torso, surprisingly effective against the damp chill in the mountains of high Alps. Shoes made of leather and packed with insulating grass were so well constructed that even modern outdoor survival experts have praised their ingenuity. This wardrobe was not accidental. It was very much the careful work of a person who knew the elements and how to prepare for them. The tools he carried revealed even more about his world. His copper-bladed axe was a weapon, but also a token of rank. Copper was valuable and not readily available. One had to know how to mine the stuff and smelt it to have such a weapon. Besides these, he held a longbow and arrows, a flint dagger, and a number of tools for repairing his gear. The presence of unfinished arrow shafts implies that he was working on replenishing his supplies during his last days. Each object suggested a life marked with perpetual preparedness, because danger in the Copper Age could come from nature, hunger, or other humans. Forensic analysis proved that the last moments of Ötzi were anything but peaceful. His left hand bore a deep defensive wound received while trying to fend off an attack. There was trauma to his ribs, and perhaps most telling of all was an arrowhead embedded deeply in his left shoulder. The wooden shaft had been removed, but the wound was lethal, having struck a major artery with consequent rapid exsanguination. What further adds to the horror is that microscopic blood analysis revealed traces from at least 4 other individuals found on his clothing and on his weapons. None of this indicates a chance occurrence, whether it was an ambush, a fight between opposing bands, or personal vengeance. The death of Ötzi was the consequence of human aggression. Somewhere in the high Alps, he died, alone, far from help, a bitter, lonely fight for his last survival. But as scientists would later discover, Ötzi's body carried more than just the story of his violent end. It also held a genetic code that would shake our understanding of ancient human history. The first DNA puzzle. From the moment scientists realized how well Ötzi's body had been preserved, it became clear that his remains offered an unprecedented opportunity, not just to study his tools or diet, but to unlock his very genetic code. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA sequencing made it possible to extract fragments of his genetic material from his tissues and bones. It was slow, painstaking work. Ancient DNA is fragile, degraded, and easily contaminated by modern genetic material. But by 2012, researchers were ready to announce something extraordinary. They had assembled a draft version of the Iceman's genome. The initial findings were nothing short of groundbreaking. Based on the sequence, scientists determined that Ötzi likely had light skin, brown eyes, and thick brown hair. This alone challenged some assumptions, as earlier reconstructions had portrayed him with paler skin and lighter features. But the real shock came from his ancestry. His genome appeared to contain markers linked to steppe populations, people associated with the Indo-European migrations that reshaped Europe thousands of years ago. This was unexpected. Historians had believed these steppe migrations reached Central Europe only centuries after Ötzi's time. If correct, this meant one of two things. Either the steppe ancestry arrived far earlier than anyone thought, or Ötzi was part of a population movement that history had entirely overlooked. The findings sparked intense debate. Some researchers hailed it as proof that prehistoric Europe's population dynamics were far more complex than believed. Others urged caution, pointing out that the science of ancient DNA analysis was still young and prone to error. Contamination lurked at every corner. After all, it could just as easily be a stray cell from the researcher's hand, the signature of modern DNA riding on the lab dust poured over the casket, or contact during excavation. The handling of his remains profusely since his discovery, well photographed and transported, thawed for autopsies, must have introduced some kind of modern DNA into the population that has been sequenced as part of the alleged steppe ancestry. Still, the temptation that maybe some of them were a reality was quite strong to close the door on. The draft genome revealed more information on Ötzi: lactose intolerance, proclivity for cardiovascular disease, and susceptibility to certain metabolic conditions, even markers indicating prior Lyme disease infection, designating him yet again as the oldest known human to contract a tick-borne disease. All those findings rendered an impression of Iceman. However, they also obscured our understanding of who he was and where he came from that much deeper. For years, the theory of steppe ancestry remained part of Ötzi's public story. It was repeated in documentaries, became part of museum exhibitions, and was discussed in classrooms. The hypothesis that he might have served as a genetic bridge between Europe's earliest farmers and their later steppe migrants had almost turned into an accepted fact. But science is merciless in pursuit of truth. The evidence from modern sequencing presents increasing ability to differentiate between ancient DNA and modern contamination. When researchers took a fresh look within more than a decade after the first sequencing of Ötzi's genome, with far more sophisticated techniques, what they found would dismantle one of the most widely circulated claims of his identity. And when the truth emerged in 2023, it didn't just rewrite Ötzi's story. It upended what we thought we knew about the roots of European civilization. The genome reborn. By 2023, ancient DNA research had advanced far beyond what was possible in 2012. Sequencing methods were more precise, contamination controls more rigorous, and computational analysis more powerful. The field had matured from experimental guesswork into a science capable of reconstructing genomes with astonishing accuracy. It was under these new standards that a team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, along with other leading geneticists, decided to revisit Ötzi's DNA from scratch. This time, they took no chances. Instead of using previously handled samples, They extracted DNA directly from dense bone in his hip, a region less exposed to environmental damage and less likely to have been contaminated. The process was methodical, with every step designed to ensure that no modern genetic material could sneak in. In essence, they were about to give the Iceman a second genetic life. When the new results came in, they revealed something stunning. The supposed step ancestry that had fueled years of speculation simply wasn't there. What earlier scientists had taken as evidence of early Indo-European migration into Central Europe turned out to be a ghost, the product of modern DNA contamination, not an ancient genetic legacy. In other words, the narrative that Ötzi had rewritten European prehistory was wrong. The implications were huge. For more than a decade, it was the fact that the step connection had been made across textbooks, documentaries, and museums, and now it was being wiped out. Researchers describe the moment as thrilling and humbling. The truth is finally coming out, but it reveals how readily early results, however exciting, mislead science. We have completely misunderstood him for over a decade, one scientist was said to have acknowledged. Yet this new genome not only corrected an error, more interestingly, painted a far more intriguing picture of who Ötzi really was. His genetic profile was remarkably isolated. Over thousands of years, most European populations have mingled through movement, conquest, and trade. Ötzi's ancestors, in contrast, mostly stayed home, preserving their Anatolian farmer heritage with almost no exterior mixing. Hence, he was sort of a genetic time capsule, a snapshot of a lineage that had all but disappeared by modern times. The correction came as a warning. Ancient DNA research is as fraught as it is promising. One contaminated sample or an assumption based on scant data can wreak years of havoc. However, when it is done right, the outcomes are even weirder than the myths they replace. The revelation reframed not only an individual biography, but rocked the very foundations of prehistoric European history. The step ancestry theory had long held sway in accounting for the wide-ranging cultural upheavals, such as the origins of languages and metalworking techniques. If indeed, for over the decade, the DNA of Ötzi was being misread, how many more ancient genomes could be telling some wrong story? The genetic rebirth of the Iceman then became a plank in the wise man's caution, that for perhaps everything we think we know, there linger doubts on evidence so flimsy, it is only a matter of time before something comes along to rattle the very crux of the premise. And what the corrected DNA revealed next, about where Ötzi's people came from and where their few surviving descendants still live, was perhaps even stranger than fiction. Ötzi's isolated bloodline. With the contamination finally stripped away, Ötzi's DNA revealed an ancestry that rewrote his place in Europe's story, not as a bridge to steppe nomads, but as a near-pure descendant of Neolithic Anatolian farmers. Over 92% of his genetic makeup traced directly to these early agricultural pioneers who some 8,000 years ago migrated from what is now Turkey into Europe. They were not mere wanderers. They brought the seeds of civilization, literally and figuratively, introducing domesticated plants and animals, pottery, and the permanent settlements that transformed humanity's way of life. For centuries after their arrival, these Anatolian farmers mixed with local hunter-gatherers across the continent. But in Ötzi's case, that mixing was minimal. Only about 8% of his genome came from Europe's older hunter-gatherer populations. This suggested that his community had remained remarkably isolated, living in a cultural and genetic bubble long after the rest of Europe began blending its lineages. The finding had an unexpected twist. Ötzi's closest living relatives are not found in the Alps where he died, nor in the surrounding regions of Austria or northern Italy. Instead, they are on the island of Sardinia, far to the south in the Mediterranean. Sardinia's geographic isolation allowed its people to retain a high percentage of that same Anatolian farmer DNA, largely untouched by the later waves of migration that reshaped Europe. Sardinia, in some way, became a genetic time capsule, just like Ötzi's body became a corporeal time capsule. Indeed, the idea that an alpine mummy connects to a Mediterranean island is almost startling. However, it makes perfect sense on the genetic level. This is because Sardinia represents a genetic sanctuary. Even though mainland Europe has experienced centuries of population shifts, from Indo-European steppe herders to later Roman, Germanic, and Slavic expansions, that, as a revelation, was exciting and sobering for historians. This meant that Ötzi was no longer the missing link in the direct line from early ancestry to modern Central Europeans as previously thought. Rather, he belonged to a branch of humanity close to extinction, a lineage once widespread throughout Europe, but almost totally erased by the tides of migration. The genetic footprint of his people's lives on only in certain isolated pockets, the largest still being Sardinia. The isolation has consequences in itself. In fact, a closed gene pool can keep unique characters alive, but also magnify weaknesses. It accumulates harmful mutations and genetic deficiencies when there is little outside DNA available to balance them. This could have been part of the reason why the genome of Ötzi was so full of markers for chronic illness, from heart attacks to metabolic disorders. His community was culturally resilient, but genetically fragile. The farmer population from Anatolia is also contrary to several old assumptions about Europe during the time of prehistoric period. If people of Ötzi possessed genetic traits different from future mixed populations, then probably their physical characteristics, skin color, hair type, and facial structure varied considerably compared to those stereotypical images often used to describe ancient Europeans. Even more intriguingly, Ötzi's genetic profile questions concepts, long held, about how and in what manner early Europeans appeared and lived, hinting that the average prehistoric European might have looked and lived much differently than the rendition popularized in textbooks and museum exhibits. Ötzi's frozen body is more than an archaeological wonder. It's a mirror, reflecting who we were and who we still are. His ancestry challenges our understanding of human migration. If his story made you see the past in a new light, like, comment, and share your thoughts. And stay tuned for more deep dives into the discoveries rewriting our history.